Happy Halloween, almost. Almost happy Halloween, guys. We're not quite there yet, but we're very, very close to being there. So, what are we going to talk about this week? Well, I mean, we're literally next Friday is Halloween. We're getting very close, and then you know what happens after Halloween. We can't hold Mariah back any longer. She melts the ice and the bounds of chains that have her in hell, and she unleashes her horrible voice for the next 2 months. It's brutal. We have to try to hold her back, at least get her close to Thanksgiving. But until then, man, we've got to celebrate Halloween. And I've been celebrating Halloween with a ton of spooky movies. You can see all my reviews on TikTok, as well as the YouTube channel, Facebook, you know how I feel about that, Instagram as well. Watched some really good ones, some good series this year. Haven't really watched any documentaries yet. Today might be a day I might just kind of watch something. I'm not feeling very great. I've kind of been back and forth. I think because Texas finally decided to turn the heat down, and it was 50 last night, and it's 70 today, which is perfect. But then it dropped to 48, and then it went up to 58. And that was just 2 days ago, was 85. So when you do a 40-degree drop just like that, you're bound to sound like this and look like this. So that's what we're dealing with. I'm going to adjust this, guys. I got a lapel mic, got my headphones on. They're super small. They're really cool headphones. And so I can hear myself. I'll have to show them to you after the show because they're just this little thin thing. And oh my God, they're not like my typical big headphones that I normally use, which I really like, to be honest with you. But this time whatever. So anyway, we're going to talk about Halloween. And we got to think about, most of us have some memories of Halloween growing up as a kid. There's very few people I know that don't appreciate the holiday. There's some. And I question why I'm still friends with them. And the jury's still out. Maybe after this Halloween, I'll be like, I can't deal with you. And I get it. Not everybody celebrates the same way as I do or with the intensity as I do. And I understand some people have different traditions. Some people don't watch horror movies. Maybe they, watch funny Halloween comedies. Maybe every Halloween they watch Lord of the Rings for some reason. I got to grab my water, so extreme close-up. Whoa, nobody's going to remember that unless you're from the 90s. Anyway, maybe that guy will comment on how I can't do a podcast again, dick. Anyway, so a lot of people do things different, and you don't have to watch horror movies. You can watch the classic monster movies. You can watch The Simpsons Treehouse of Horrors. To me, there's so many different ways to celebrate. Some people only celebrate that week of, or maybe on Halloween, they stay in that night and they watch horror movies, they drink pumpkin beers, and whatever you do. But I think most of us have a memory of what Halloween was. But do you really know? Do you really know the history? Maybe you have heard things from people that don't celebrate Halloween, how it's the devil and we must, say no, and witchcraft. And, maybe you grew up in Michigan. Maybe you grew up in Detroit like I did. And, you grew up there hearing about Devil's Night, the night before Halloween when Detroit was set on fire. And I highly recommend you Google if you don't know about Devil's Night. Maybe you grew up in Michigan, the outskirts of Michigan, the outskirts of Detroit, and you went to those haunted houses like I did. And they were just completely intense. And quite frankly, I haven't been to a good haunted house since I left Michigan. I've been to several and they're just not great. That being said, do you really know about Halloween? Do you know where the jack-o'-lantern came from? Maybe most of you do, but I'm willing to bet that some of you don't. So let's go back. Let's go to Ireland, where Halloween originated. Let's go dive into some Irish folklore. And let's talk about our man, Stingy Jack. That was the man. This is the man who tricked the devil. So many times when Stingy Jack tricked the devil to take his soul, he tricked him so that the devil could never take his soul. And the story of Stingy Jack is really kind of a central tradition to modern day Halloween and the jack-o'-lantern. The devil gave up on taking Stingy Jack and taking his soul. And when Stingy Jack finally died, he was refused heaven and refused hell. And he was forced to wander the earth and wander the countryside for all eternity because he had tricked the devil, and he probably deserved to go to hell, according to legend, and heaven wouldn't take him. So what happens next? Stingy Jack was given by the devil a burning coal to light his way throughout the night, throughout the fields of Ireland, throughout the towns. So Stingy Jack decided to put this burning coal in a turnip. Now, turnips over in Ireland, they're bigger. I'm sure you guys know what a turnip is. And he would carve it so that the light could see through, but then he wouldn't have to hold this burning coal in his hand, and he'd hold the turnip. Guys, if you Google a picture of a carved turnip, absolutely terrifying. But that's what happened. They became Stingy Jack, and he became known as the Jack of the Lantern. Later, Jack-o'-lantern, right? It's kind of the same thing. Here comes my cat. He's going to yell at me in 3, 2, 1, yell. No? Okay. I see him looking at me. God forbid I do a podcast and he can't comment on it. And that's where it came from. But when the Irish immigrants came over and they immigrated to our country, I know Donald Trump's going to be mad I'm talking about this. When they immigrated to our country, they've realized that pumpkins grew way more here. They were way more easier to grow. They were bigger, and that you could actually carve a pumpkin better than you could carve a turnip. So they decided to carve pumpkins and set them out for Stingy Jack. And it passed on, and that's where we got the jack-o'-lantern. Now, some people say that the jack-o'-lantern was to ward off evil spirits, and there are certain history and certain moments in time where that was kind of the theme of the jack-o'-lantern. Some people would put out pumpkins without the faces to bless them. So that's kind of where it came from. But the American adaptation is we do the pumpkins, and it all resonates all the way back over 2,000 years to Stingy Jack, which I think is really cool. And obviously, I've never tried to carve a turnip before in my life. But I imagine that would be difficult. I've seen the pictures. I'm looking at a picture right now, and maybe I'll post one on TikTok or my YouTube channel about what the original OG jack-o'-lantern looked like. And you do have to remember that Halloween is 2,000 years old. It's over 2,000 years old. And yes, it originated in Ireland. And a lot of people they don't like to think about what it is because, it was, pre-Christianity, and they were worshiping other gods. They had other beliefs. So some Christians and all that don't celebrate Halloween because of where it originated from. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what to do. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, you can't celebrate Halloween and not be a Christian. That's just not true. But you'll hear that, which is why you see a lot of the churches do like fall festivals. Some of the churches, I remember growing up too, and I'm kind of getting off the subject a little as I go back to the history and some of these weird, strange Halloween traditions and facts that some of you might not know about. I remember growing up in this church, and we would still go trick-or-treating, but they would always have some sort of fall festival, right? Some sort of Halloween alternative where you were inside and you could go to different rooms and collect candy. They would be decorated. Yes, you had costumes, but it was never, slashers or anything like that. Maybe I dressed up as a ninja or something. And I remember my parents took me. And I don't know how old I was, because like I said, I still went trick-or-treating. So it wasn't that this was the alternative to trick-or-treating. This was just like in addition to, so bonus night, right? But I'll never forget how dumb it was. And maybe at the time I enjoyed it. Because I'm a kid, right? And I'm getting free Halloween stuff. I'm getting free treats and all this. And I'm familiar with the church and the people there. But I remember the room, and it had 2 doors. One was all dark. Had like this dark construction paper over the door. And there was like a smoke machine. And then the other one was like, it looked like cotton balls like clouds. So essentially, one was a door to hell and one was a door to heaven. That's kind of messed up, but I remember this. And you would knock on the door, and you had to pick which door, which is cool. You know, you make it interactive. I get that. So you had to pick which door to go to. And I knocked on hell's door, which is probably not the first time I've knocked on hell's door in real life, but whatever. And somebody opened it, and they had a generic black mask on and the eyes glowed. And he's like, you don't want this door. If you come in, you can. They're essentially trying to scare me with the devil. And then I was like, okay. And then you got another turn. So I knocked on. I didn't get anything. They just were freaking me out, basically telling me I'm going to hell. I knocked on the door to heaven, the stairway to heaven, you know, with Led Zeppelin. I knocked on that. And the door cracks, and there's this bright light, and this little tiny, like, it almost looks like they had a Fisher-Price fishing pole. That's my imagination, or at least my memory of it. Lower down, this little piece of candy wrapped in tape on this little tiny, like, bucket. Rolled it down, and I took the candy, and then it closed. So if you go to heaven, God uses a Fisher-Price fishing pole to give you candy. If you go to hell, Satan says you get nothing. That was the message. But I remember seeing multiple messages throughout, which that's fine. That's their right. I'm not putting it down. But it felt really forced and stupid. And I also felt like, why am I here? When they feel like this is the alternative to Halloween, these people are not going trick-or-treating. Most of the kids that were there, this was it. They wouldn't go trick-or-treating. But I knew I would. I was going to my grandma and papa's house to the big fat candy bars. Full-size bars, yo. So why was I there? It just felt very hypocritical to me. I didn't like it. So whatever. I digress. But they forget that back in Ireland, where Halloween originated from, in the rural areas, it was, you know, and even today, in the rural areas, there's massive bonfires, and they do have kids that dress up, and they kind of keep it smaller, but they put out the jack-o'-lanterns and all that. And even in the cities, it might be more modernized with parades and all that. But people forget that Halloween, oh my God, I'm dying. I hope I'm not, as I'm talking about Halloween. Halloween was a celebration, okay? It was Samhain, and it was the end of the harvest and the end of summer and fall and going into winter. And it was at that time that they believed that the two seasons and the two planes of the living and the undead, or the dead, I should say, not undead, they're not zombies, that they were in sync. And it was at that time, as everything was changing into the next season and the crops were done. It was a celebration of that, but it was that time that you were mostly connected to the other world, that the dead were connected to the living and vice versa. This is where all the witchcraft and all that, and there was witches and people that believed in certain things. There were sacrifices there, but not all of this was human Kali Ma, Temple of Doom stuff. They would put out apples and fruits and maybe sacrifice a goat, or a sheep or whatever. And there were talks that the witches would kidnap a child and kill him. That was there too. But for the most part, it was a celebration. And they said you did have to be careful. Mind you, this is their belief back then. You had to be careful because the dead walked the earth. And if you opened your mind to it and your doors and your home to it, they may never leave and go on to the next life, right? And this was back in the Celts and, you know, the Celt days and all that. But after trick-or-treating, there'd be parties. They would have, you know, different games, and games are still played this day, but the games that we are very familiar with, that again, the Irish immigrated over here and kind of gave us this. Thank you, Ireland. Thanks, Paul. Thank you for it. I mean that, because God, what if you didn't come over here? I'd have no Halloween. And they would have a game called Snap Apple. And you might be familiar with this because it's like bobbing for apples. So you would have an apple on a string, and it was tied to a door frame or a tree, and players would attempt to bite the hanging apple. Arms behind their back. Sometimes they'd be blindfolded and you'd have to bite it. Whoever got the biggest bite wins. Whoever got the apple removed would win. And then eventually they would do the bobbing for apples. But they would also have treasure hunts. Parents would arrange these little treasure hunts, which would have little knickknacks and treats and small figurines cut out of wood, or God, maybe even like, a shilling, and they would find the treasure. They would also have an Irish card game that they played where cards were laid face down. I have to read this. Laid face down on a table with candy or even coins underneath them. When a child chooses the card, and not all of them had that, not all of them had everything underneath, they would flip the card over, you would receive that prize. And you got to imagine this back then. A kid getting a piece of candy and was able to eat it. People had no money, or maybe there was a coin, and what it was worth, but what it meant to that child as they would paint their faces and often dress up. And then, of course, they had all kinds of parties in the neighborhood. And a traditional food eaten on Halloween in Ireland, and to this day it's there, it's called barnbrack. It's a kind of fruit cake that could be bought in stores or made at home. So picture a small loaf of like fruits, but it's more like a savory dessert. They would wrap the treat up. They would wrap up a treat inside the cake, and it was supposed to tell the eater's fortune and future. So if it's almost like those, and I forget the name of them, where there's that little baby Jesus inside this giant donut cake, and if you get the little baby Jesus, it's like good luck, and they got the Mardi Gras king cakes and all that. Anyway, so that was kind of the thing. And they still do that today in these small little loaves. They bake them, and some people maybe didn't want to bake them or didn't have a recipe or whatever, didn't want to do it. They'd buy them, but most people would bake them and they would give them away as gifts. The original ding dong, doorbell, ditch, whatever, happened in Ireland. It was called knockadolly. And that's when children would run to their neighbor's house, knock on the doors, but run away before the door was open, and they would hide and watch the reaction. This was encouraged in Ireland. This was something that wasn't frowned upon. This was something that neighbors expected. It was almost an honor if the children actually did this. If they did this to your house, and nowadays you get shot. And even I would do it growing up back in the day, and it was still kind of like sketchy. But yeah, they would do that, and they would watch and laugh from the bushes, and nobody ever knew which kids did it. But in these small towns, you could almost figure out which kids would do it. I thought that was really cool. Of course, we have traditions from all around the world too. In Japan, there's moments of Halloween-esque that they do. Now, some of the days are different. There's been moments where they do it on the 31st and they adapt, but they usually have not real pumpkins, but porcelain decorated pumpkins or fruits with different faces. They would have cats. The cats would have different faces on them. And a lot of this was to ward off evil spirits. But then they would also have balls and dance rooms or costume parties where you get these lavish outfits, not always scary, but just dressing up. Some of them were callbacks to ancient times and their ancestors. Some of them, those costumes were passed on from decade to decade to decade in a family tradition. And when the girl or guy reached a certain age, they could wear this costume out on this special day, which I thought is really cool. You also have some other traditions that maybe got lost in time. There was one tradition in Ireland where you had to steal something from your enemy. And the reason, and I'm not talking his wife or a horse, something, a hammer, a shovel. Maybe you went and he had corn stalks and you picked your own corn. I'm just making things up, potatoes. I don't know. And the reason for it was if you stole from your enemy, that enemy had no control or power over you anymore. And you could essentially bury the hatchet because now those feelings were gone. Now, if you got caught, then the feud would just escalate, and it said it ended families. It said it became, there were murders. And this is where the curses would come, because it was said that often if people caught, like if I went to go steal from my buddy who turned my enemy and I went to take his potatoes and they caught me, they would then seek out a witch to put a curse on me. And there were very few ways to break these curses. You'd have to go to the witch. You'd have to make amends, all these things, and it would spiral out of control. Whether that's true or not, that was a thing. Now, of course, as the years went on, stealing became it was always illegal and punishable by death at times. And then as they got to the United States, obviously that disappeared. But there are parts in Ireland that people have still talked about this tradition, and people still have the old witch houses. Maybe they're part of the museum, like a historical, or maybe they're just the shells of what they once were. But you could go to the witch house or the cave or the, ruins of these alleged witches, and you could perform something there to put a curse on somebody in modern times. So I think no matter what, these are still things that people follow or believe in at some point. And obviously we have modernized Halloween. We have modernized Halloween with the horror movies. We have lifted up these slashers as celebrities. We have tradition Halloween shows, the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. It's something that has been around that I'm going to watch tonight, that I watch every year. Is the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. Horror movies typically, oddly enough, they're not real good about coming out in October. They always come out like late November, middle of November, or honestly, sometimes like in the summer. I feel like more horror movies, this year they did better, but I feel like more horror movies need to happen around Halloween time. Carving pumpkins is huge. That's still a tradition that's held. Matter of fact, Luke and I, we carved our very first pumpkin this year. Typically, we don't carve them. We'll paint them. We were big into buying sticker packs and paints and decorating them that way. And it was really cool. Excuse me, especially when he's younger. Because carving a pumpkin's a pain in the butt, period. But when he was younger, he could be involved in it without dealing with knives and all that. And also being in Texas, we would have those pumpkins done within the first couple days of October, and they'd be out. And I kept my pumpkins out all the way till after Thanksgiving. Then I'd throw them away, because pumpkins are part of the fall. They're part of Thanksgiving, even if they're decorated for Halloween. We cut it this year. So I doubt that my pumpkin will be alive come post Halloween. I'm probably just going to get rid of him, to be honest. We'll see if his face starts to melt and all that, but it was fun. We put music on, made Shirley Temples, sat on the patio, and we're just hanging out, listening to music while we were ripping all the guts out and letting Luke go to town. And I assisted, and he made some crazy designs, but that's a tradition that holds. Obviously, going to haunted houses is a tradition. I think they're kind of dying. I'll be honest. Even in major metropolitan cities, I don't think they're nearly as cool as they once were. You'll always have the ones that come back every year. There's one in Plano that I've yet to go to. That's actually year round. And it changes its theme. There's one for Christmas they do, and I think it's like a Krampus theme one. So I want to go to that this year. Depending on the reviews, I'll decide if I'm going to take Luke or not, but I think I got to go. And but back in the day, they were popping up all over the place, especially in Michigan. And I don't know if that's just the Midwest vibe. I don't know, but there's been a bunch of them in Dallas that got shut down. A lot of it's a safety issue. COVID, like many things, destroyed that. But it's still a tradition that is there. You know what I mean? One of the big things too, going back to traditions in Japan, they have Halloween trains. So trick-or-treating doesn't typically take place. It doesn't take place in Japan, but they celebrate through parades in the streets and all that, but they actually do a trick-or-treat train, where a train, which is normally like a very quiet place, turns into a celebration. And this is where some of those costumes can be worn, and you can have like unique themes per cart. One theme might be a spooky Japanese urban legend. One theme might be celebrities. One theme might be fashion. One, like all that. And they have a and you kind of let loose and all that, when typically on a train it's very reserved and very quiet, unlike the United States. In Italy, so it's really celebrated on All Saints Day, and this goes all the way back to the 4th century. They honor the martyrs and the saints of the Catholic Church. So it's essentially almost like the Day of the Dead, but they are celebrating the saints of the church, which I'm sure some of you guys know. They do this in New York as well. In Sicily, it's believed that the dead bring sweets or small gifts to well-behaved children. And in the Lombardy region, it's customary to leave a vase full of water in the kitchen for the dead to drink when they're on their visit. So think Santa Claus. You leave milk and cookies. Here, the dead are coming to leave little sweets and treats for the children as they thank you for honoring us. And you leave them a glass of water, because being dead is hard and you probably don't get a lot of water. That's actually kind of cool. That's fun too. Guatemala is a big one too. Huge Day of the Dead, All Saints Day, 3,000-year-old tradition, and it's all connected to kite flying. They construct these massive kites out of paper, cloth, and bamboo. They decorate them with symbols of their history, their ancestry, their families, their, anything that maybe they feel very passionate about, and they fly them through the air. And I'm not just talking your dollar store kites. These pictures of what they've done in Guatemala, beautiful. And it's sometimes they address social issues. Sometimes they address like a loved one, or maybe if they just had a new job or a baby, they'll paint these beautiful pictures on these kites and fly them. So it is still very much a kind of Halloween-y thing, but it's not, I said Halloween-y, but not typically what we do. A lot of these are connected to All Saints Day. I mean, even the Day of the Dead and all that. All of these. I mean, October 31st in Costa Rica, you wear large, colorful, handmade masks and dance through the streets with folk music. It's a 200-year-old tradition back to pre-Columbian customs. And you get kind of judged on your masking skills and how you can really create this mask. And they are very, very, some are big, some are like, pop culture references and mythology. Some of them are porcelain, and you don't want to be recognized. And they have beautiful bands and food, and then eventually you take them off. Obviously, in modern times, people take them off earlier, but you're supposed to take them off in private and then just go celebrate the night when you're done with your mask. And that does take place on October 31st. So you can see that the dead, the celebration of saints, the celebration of loved ones, treats, spooks, haunts, that is not an American thing. That goes deep rooted in history. And we've just adapted it through learning about other cultures, through experiencing other cultures, and honestly, from the migrants and immigrants, I should say, who have come to our country to help build that tradition. Imagine if none of that was possible. If the Irish never came here, if the Italians never came, I would never be here. If we just had a boring, generic, whatever. Imagine that. No Halloween the way we know it. Some people think that Halloween is dead. I think that COVID did the best thing possible. The only good thing I think about COVID, there's two things for me on a personal level that I think about COVID. Number one, I got to spend some amazing time with Luke when he was just 3 years old because I was home. I got to watch those moments and develop him and hang with him. And some of the best moments I had with him growing up was during that COVID time. Yes, it was rough. I'm not going to say that, but I'm looking at it on the positive. The other positive is I think when we bounced back, the holidays took a huge leap of going back to traditions. I saw more people that first Halloween after COVID. I saw more people decorating, more people with their pumpkins. Even if things were still kind of closed down at times, I saw more people out there. And I think since then we've seen it, because I think in some places it took a dip. And really it's generational. If there's a lot of kids in the subdivision, it's going to be a Halloween thing. But if the kids are growing and they're not near a school and they kind of age out and nobody's really moving into that subdivision and the demographic has changed to older people, there's not going to be a lot of trick-or-treaters because there's nobody to engage. There's nobody to participate. So yeah, you could decorate and maybe buy a little candy, but most people are going to hit the hot spots. If you're a subdivision near an apartment, you're going to get hit because nobody's trick-or-treating in those apartments. Maybe they're going to relatives, but they're going to go to the nearest subdivision, park a car or walk there and really experience Halloween. So it does come in waves, but I have seen a resurgence. I've been driving. Luke and I look at Halloween decorations. So we drive much like Christmas lights. We go to different subdivisions or we'll go for a walk. He's in the wagon. We're drinking some hot chocolate, although we haven't had to do hot chocolate lately, except for the last 2 days maybe. But we're just kind of walking and looking at really cool Halloween decorations. I am seeing more stores, restaurants, mom and pop shops, houses, even entrances to apartment complexes embracing it. And you know what? That's what we need to carry the tradition on. I've beaten it into Luke's head, and he knows it's my favorite holiday every year. And we watch our movies, and albeit he can't watch everything, we've tried a couple, and I'm like, stop it. But we have some that we've watched. I just watched that movie Stitchhead, which drops on October 29th at every theater out there. Thank you to Pixel Scene Media for that. And we got to watch it together. Super cute, fun movie. But we also are going to watch Megan 2.0 and Five Nights at Freddy's on Halloween. We've watched Shaun of the Dead. You know, there's other things that we've watched to kind of embrace until he's ready. He just watched Tremors at his mom's house, the first one, which is awesome. But there's other things that he can embrace before he gets into like some of the I don't need him to watch these serial killer stuff right now. His mind is still developing. I need it to develop without being corrupt. And who knows? Maybe one day he's going to grow up and not like Halloween. I'm going to do a DNA test then. But I think he's going to always remember what Dad and him did. How I decorate and how from October 1st till November 1st, it's spooky season. I buy him a new shirt every year and jammies. We get our costumes. We go to Spirit Halloween. I keep calling it Halloween USA. It tells you how old I am. Everything's decorated. We get our pumpkins. Man, I get him a new cup every year. Like he's got a Michael Myers cup. And I buy him the pumpkin treats and this, and we go all out. And I'm hoping that he remembers that because it's important to me. And hopefully one day if he has kids, he'll pass it on. And then he'll talk about the Halloween traditions that he has, and maybe he'll look at the history. So that's it for me today, guys. Next week is the final spooky season of Halloween. I'll do a costume reveal. And then we'll get back to some normalcy in November, which some other Life of the Average Joe podcast stuff. Thanks for listening. See you next time.